Some people don't walk into danger, danger recognizes them first. Claire Bennett didn't believe in luck anymore, not after 28 years of scraping by, not after learning that survival came in 12-hour shifts and overdue notices stacked on a kitchen counter that barely held together. That morning, she stood in front of a mirror no bigger than a tablet, tying her hair back with steady hands while her 6-year-old son, Ethan, sat on the edge of the bed swinging his legs. Asking if this new job meant they could finally stop moving, she didn't answer right away, because promises were expensive and she had nothing left to spend, so instead she smiled, soft but tired, and said, "It means we try again," and that was enough for him. The address she'd been given didn't look real when the rideshare pulled up, iron gates rising higher than anything she'd ever stood near, stretching wide like they were keeping the world out, or maybe keeping something in. The driver didn't speak, just glanced at her through the mirror with a look that lingered a second too long before she stepped out into silence that felt heavier than sound. Cameras tracked movement she couldn't see, and somewhere beyond the gates, a system she didn't understand had already begun measuring her presence, weighing it, deciding something about her before she ever crossed the threshold. Inside, the air changed, cooler, sharper, like the house itself was watching. Polished floors reflected light that didn't feel warm, and men in tailored suits moved without noise, without wasted motion, their attention never quite landing on her but never leaving either. Ethan's small hand tightened around hers, and she squeezed back, grounding herself in the only thing that still felt real. "Stay close," she whispered, more to herself than to him. She was led through hallways that seemed to stretch forever, past doors that stayed closed, past rooms that looked untouched, until she was handed a uniform and a list of rules delivered in a tone that made it clear they weren't suggestions. Don't speak unless spoken to, don't wander, don't ask questions, and most importantly, never interrupt him. Claire nodded, because she had learned long ago that some places didn't need explanations, only obedience. She changed quickly, the fabric unfamiliar against her skin, and when she stepped back into the corridor, something shifted, subtle but immediate, like a line had been crossed. She felt it before she saw him. Adrian Volkov didn't announce his presence. He didn't need to. The air adjusted around him. People did too, conversations ending before they began, footsteps slowing, heads lowering just slightly as he passed. He walked like the space belonged to him because it did, every inch of it, every shadow, every silence. Claire kept her eyes down at first, focusing on the rhythm of her breathing, the weight of the tray in her hands, the steady reminder that she was here to work, nothing more. But something made her look up, just for a second, just enough to meet his gaze, and that was her first mistake. He didn't stop walking, didn't change direction, but his eyes stayed on her a fraction longer than necessary, sharp, assessing, like he was reading something she hadn't meant to show. Claire felt it like pressure against her chest, the instinct to look away fighting the strange pull to hold steady, and for reasons she couldn't explain. She didn't flinch. Behind her, Ethan shifted, his curiosity stronger than caution, his small voice almost breaking the silence before she could stop him, and in that moment, something invisible tilted, something that hadn't existed a second ago. Adrian noticed. He always noticed, and somewhere deep in a system built on control, a quiet disruption had already begun. Claire told herself not to look again, but awareness does not ask for permission, it settles in the body, quiet and persistent. And even as Adrian Volkov walked past without a word, the space he left behind felt altered, like something invisible had shifted direction. Ethan noticed it too in his own way, his small fingers loosening from her hand just enough to turn his head, curiosity bright in his eyes despite the tension that seemed to press against every wall, and Claire gently pulled him closer, lowering her voice to a whisper that carried more urgency than sound. "Stay with me," because she had already broken one rule and she could not afford another. The rest of the morning unfolded in careful movements, polished surfaces, measured steps, the rhythm of a place that ran on control, and Claire learned quickly that every action here had weight, even the smallest ones, even the way she placed a glass down or folded a cloth, because someone was always watching, even when no one appeared to be. She kept her head down, focused on the tasks in front of her, but her mind moved faster, cataloging exits, memorizing turns, mapping the unfamiliar like she had done in every place she had ever needed to survive, except this place was different. This place did not feel temporary, it felt like it had already decided something about her. Hours passed without incident until it happened. Small enough to be dismissed anywhere else, but here it was not small at all. Ethan slipped from her side when she turned for a second, just 1 second, drawn by a hallway that looked no different than the others but carried an unspoken boundary, and by the time she noticed, he was already walking toward it, his steps light, unafraid, the kind of innocence that did not recognize danger because it had never been explained in a way a child could understand. Claire's heart tightened, not in panic, but in precision, and she moved quickly, her voice low but firm, calling his name. Once, then again, but he kept going, curious about something he could not yet see. 2 men stepped forward at the end of the corridor, not aggressive, not loud, but present in a way that changed everything, their posture alone enough to draw a line no one crossed. Claire reached Ethan just as he slowed, her hand closing around his shoulder, pulling him gently but decisively back toward her, and that was when the air shifted again. Adrian was there, she had not heard him approach, but she felt it, the same quiet pressure as before, stronger now, closer, and when she looked up, there was no distance left between observation and decision. The men in suits did not move, they waited, because whatever happened next was not theirs to control. Claire did not step back, she did not apologize immediately, she did not lower her gaze the way she had been told to. Instead she placed herself fully between her son and whatever this moment was becoming, her voice steady despite the weight behind it. He did not know, and for a second that stretched longer than it should have, nothing happened. Adrian studied her, not the situation, not the mistake, but her, the way she stood, the way she chose, the way she did not move even when everything in this place suggested she should. Ethan looked up at her, then at him, unaware of the line he had crossed, only aware that his mother's hand was firm and warm and not letting go. Somewhere behind them, someone shifted, a breath held too long, a rule waiting to be enforced, but Adrian did not look away. His gaze moved once, from Claire to the child, then back again, something unreadable passing through his expression before it disappeared completely, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, controlled, and final. Let him stay, and that was all it took. The tension did not break, it changed, redirected, like a current finding a new path, and for the first time since she stepped inside those gates, Claire realized that this place did not only follow rules, it followed him, and somehow, without understanding how or why, she had just become part of that equation. Silence lingered long after the words were spoken, not empty, but charged, like the walls themselves were adjusting to something they did not fully understand. Claire did not move right away, her hand still resting protectively on Ethan's shoulder, her body angled just enough to keep him behind her, because instinct did not disappear simply because danger had not followed through. The men in suits stepped back first, subtle but unmistakable, their posture easing by a fraction as if a signal had been given without sound, and that alone told her more than any explanation could have. This place did not question decisions, it absorbed them. Ethan looked up again, curious, unafraid, his voice soft but clear as he asked, "Are we in trouble?" And Claire felt something tighten in her chest, not fear, but the weight of how close they had come to something she could not name. She knelt slightly, bringing herself to his level, her voice calm, steady. "No, we are just learning the rules," even though she knew that was only part of the truth. When she stood again, Adrian was still there, watching, not impatient, not distracted, simply present in a way that made time feel slower around him. His gaze shifted once more, lingering on Ethan for a brief moment before returning to Claire, and there was something different in it now, not softer, not warmer, but focused in a way that suggested interest rather than judgment. Claire lowered her eyes this time. Not out of fear, but out of understanding, because she had already pushed far enough for one day. Adrian turned without another word, his steps measured, controlled, and the space seemed to follow him as he left, tension pulling back like a tide that had decided, for now, not to rise. The hallway returned to its previous stillness, but it did not feel the same. Nothing did. Claire exhaled slowly, not realizing she had been holding her breath, and guided Ethan back toward the main corridor, her thoughts moving faster than her steps, replaying the moment again and again, searching for what she might have missed. She had expected correction, consequence, something clear and defined, but what she received instead was something far more unsettling: permission. And permission, in a place like this, meant attention. The rest of the afternoon passed with a different kind of awareness, not just of the work, but of the way eyes followed her just a second longer than before, the way Conversations paused when she entered a room, the way the environment itself seemed to shift around her presence. She kept her movements precise, careful, giving nothing away, but inside, something had already changed, a quiet realization that she was no longer invisible here, and invisibility had been her safest asset. Ethan stayed close now, sensing the difference even if he could not explain it. His small hand finding hers more often, his usual questions quieter, as if he too felt the weight of unseen lines. Near the end of her shift, Claire was sent to a quieter wing of the house, one that felt less occupied, more private, and as she moved through it, she noticed details she had not before, photographs placed deliberately, rooms that carried presence without people, a life that existed beyond the structure of rules and silence. She paused briefly in front of one frame, not close enough to be intrusive, but enough to see that it held something personal, something that did not match the cold precision of everything else. She did not linger long, because instinct told her not to, but the image stayed with her as she continued, a reminder that even in a place built on control, there were pieces that did not fit the pattern. When her shift finally ended, the sky outside had dimmed into evening, the light softer, quieter, and as she stepped back through those towering gates with Ethan beside her, she expected relief, distance, or return to something familiar, but the feeling did not come. Instead, she carried something with her, subtle but undeniable, the sense that the day had not ended, that something had started the moment Adrian said those 3 words, and that whatever it was not finished with her yet. Claire did not sleep that night, not really, because even when her eyes closed, her mind kept replaying the same moment, the same voice, the same quiet command that had changed something she could not yet define. The apartment felt smaller than usual, the hum of the old refrigerator louder, the city outside more distant, as if a part of her was still standing inside that mansion where silence carried weight and every glance meant something. Ethan slept beside her, one arm stretched across the thin blanket, his breathing steady, untouched by the tension that followed her home, and Claire watched him for a long time, grounding herself in that rhythm, reminding herself why she had taken the job in the first place. Survival had always been simple in theory. You worked, you endured, you moved forward, but nothing about that place felt simple, and nothing about Adrian Volkov felt predictable. Morning came too quickly, pale light slipping through the blinds, and Claire moved through her routine with quiet precision, preparing breakfast, packing Ethan's small bag, checking the time twice even though she already knew she was early. She needed to be early. When they arrived at the gates again, the same stillness greeted them, but this time it felt different, not unfamiliar, just aware, like the house remembered her. The guards did not ask questions, the gates opened without hesitation. And that alone told her everything she needed to know. She had already been expected, inside. The rhythm resumed, polished floors, controlled movement, voices kept low, but now there was a shift beneath it, subtle but constant, like a current running just under the surface. Claire kept her focus on her tasks, moving room to room, keeping Ethan close when she could, letting him sit quietly when she could not. But it did not take long for the pattern to break again. She felt it before she saw him, the same quiet presence, the same adjustment in the air, and when she turned, Adrian was standing at the far end of the hallway, not passing through this time, not moving at all, just watching. She lowered her gaze instinctively, but not before noticing that his attention was not entirely on her. It shifted, briefly, toward Ethan, who sat on a low bench tracing patterns on the surface with his finger, unaware that he was being observed. Seconds passed, maybe longer, and Claire told herself to keep moving, to continue as if nothing had changed, because that was the safest choice. But her awareness refused to settle. Adrian stepped closer, not quickly, not slowly, just enough to close the distance that mattered, and when he stopped, his voice was as controlled as before. He should not be in the main corridors, and Claire felt the weight of the statement, not an accusation, not quite a warning, but something in between. She straightened slightly, her tone respectful but steady. I understand. Even though she also understood that there were no clear boundaries for a child who did not belong to this world. Adrian's gaze remained on Ethan for a moment longer, something unreadable passing through his expression before he spoke again, quieter this time. There is a smaller room near the east wing. It will be quieter, and the suggestion caught her off guard, not because of the words, but because of what they implied. He was not removing the problem, he was adjusting around it. Claire nodded once, accepting the direction, but also recognizing the shift. Small but undeniable, and as she guided Ethan toward the hallway he had indicated, she felt it again, that subtle change in the atmosphere, the way people noticed without reacting, the way decisions made by one person reshaped everything else. Behind her, Adrian did not follow, but his presence lingered, like a thought that refused to fade, and as Claire stepped into the quieter part of the house, she realized something she had not allowed herself to consider before: this was no longer just a job. And whatever reason he had for allowing them to stay, it was not something that would remain simple for long. The east wing was quieter, but not empty, and Claire felt at the moment she stepped inside, the kind of silence that was chosen, not accidental, where every detail seemed placed with intention rather than use. Ethan noticed the difference too, his steps slowing as he looked around, curiosity returning in small, careful movements, and for the first time since they arrived, he let go of her hand without drifting too far, as if the space itself felt safer. The room Adrian had mentioned was simple compared to the rest of the house, smaller, with soft light coming through tall windows and furniture that looked used instead of displayed, and Claire paused just inside the doorway, taking it in, trying to understand why this place felt different from everything else. She set her supplies down slowly, keeping her movements measured, but her mind stayed alert, because nothing here happened without reason, and she could not shake the feeling that this room had been chosen for more than just convenience. Ethan moved toward the window, pressing his hand lightly against the glass, watching the ground stretch out beyond the walls, and his voice came softer this time, almost thoughtful. "It feels quieter here." And Claire nodded, because she felt it too, the absence of pressure, the absence of watching eyes, at least on the surface. She let him settle before returning to her tasks, working through the routine she had been given, but the rhythm felt different now, less about avoiding mistakes and more about observing the spaces between them. Time passed without interruption, and for a while, it almost felt normal, until it did not. She noticed it first in the reflection of the window, not directly, just a shift in movement behind her. Subtle enough that someone else might have missed it, but Claire had learned to trust what she could not immediately see. She turned slowly, not abruptly, not drawing attention, and there he was again, Adrian, standing just outside the doorway, not entering, not announcing himself, simply present. He did not speak right away, and neither did she, because this place had already taught her that silence carried meaning. And when he finally stepped inside, the air adjusted around him the same way it always did, quiet, controlled, final. His gaze moved across the room, taking in the details, the arrangement, the small figure by the window, before settling briefly on Claire, and there was something different this time, not just observation, but consideration. Ethan turned then, noticing him fully, and instead of shrinking back or looking away, he studied him with the open curiosity only a child could have. Unfiltered, unafraid, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them, something Claire could not define but could feel. Adrian broke it first, his voice low, even. He adapts quickly, and Claire felt the shift in the words, not a critique, not a warning, but something closer to acknowledgement. She answered carefully, choosing each word with intention. He has had to, because that was the truth she could not soften. Adrian's expression did not change, but his gaze lingered on Ethan a second longer than before, and Claire realized that this was no longer just about rules or boundaries. This was something else, something forming quietly beneath the surface. Ethan stepped closer without hesitation, stopping just a few feet away, looking up at Adrian with that same steady curiosity, and asked, "Do you live here all the time?" And Claire felt her breath catch, not because of the question itself, but because of how easily it crossed lines she had spent all day trying not to touch. For a second, she expected correction, distance, something to re-establish control, but Adrian did not react the way she anticipated. He looked down at the boy, not dismissing, not ignoring, and answered simply, "Yes," and that was it. No elaboration, no explanation, just a truth offered without weight. Ethan nodded as if that made sense, as if everything here could be understood in simple answers, and stepped back toward the window, satisfied in a way that only children could be. Claire remained still, aware that something subtle but significant had just happened again, another small shift, another line adjusted rather than enforced, and as Adrian turned to leave, his presence fading from the room but not from the atmosphere, she understood something she had not allowed herself to fully admit until now. He was not just watching them anymore. He was allowing them to exist within his world on terms that did not apply to anyone else, and that kind of attention was not protection. Not yet, but it was not neutral either. The room felt different after he left, not quieter, not louder, just aware, like something unseen had shifted and decided to stay. Claire continued her work, but her movement slowed just slightly, her attention divided between the tasks in her hands and the space around her, because she could feel it now, the pattern forming, the way his presence lingered. Even when he was no longer in the room, Ethan had returned to the window, tracing shapes into the faint condensation with his finger, humming softly to himself, a small, steady sound that did not belong in a place built on silence, and Claire let it stay, because it grounded her, because it reminded her that not everything here followed the same rules. Minutes passed, then more, and just when the rhythm began to settle again, the door opened without a sound. Claire did not turn immediately this time. She had learned that reacting too quickly revealed more than she wanted, but she knew before she looked. The air had shifted again, precise and controlled. Adrian stepped inside, not stopping at the doorway now, moving further into the room as if the distance between them no longer required permission. His gaze moved first to Ethan, then to the window, then to the details Claire had arranged, small, deliberate observations that suggested he noticed everything, even the things that seemed insignificant. Claire straightened slightly, not defensive, not submissive, simply aware, and waited. He did not speak right away, and in that silence, she realized something that unsettled her more than any command could have. He was not here because of a rule, he was here because he chose to be. Ethan noticed him again, his head tilting slightly, curiosity unchanged, and this time he did not stay quiet. "Do you always walk this quiet?" The question came out simple, unfiltered, and Claire felt the familiar tension return, the instinct to correct, to step in, to remind him of boundaries that had already blurred beyond recognition. But Adrian answered before she could, his voice low, almost thoughtful. "It is easier that way," and Ethan considered that for a second, then nodded as if that answer made complete sense. Claire watched the exchange carefully, not the words, but the way it unfolded. The way Adrian did not dismiss him, did not redirect, did not enforce distance the way someone in his position normally would, and that difference was becoming harder to ignore. Adrian's attention shifted back to Claire then, steady, measuring, and for a moment it felt like the room narrowed around that gaze, not threatening, but focused in a way that demanded awareness. "You are adjusting," he said, not a question, not approval, just a statement placed between them. Claire met his gaze briefly before lowering it again, choosing her response with care. "I learned quickly, because anything more would have been unnecessary." Something passed through his expression, subtle, unreadable, but present, and then he looked away first, breaking the moment in a way that felt deliberate. He moved toward the window, stopping a few feet from Ethan, not too close, not distant either, and for a second, they stood there in the same frame, one built from control, the other from innocence. And the contrast felt sharper than anything Claire had seen all day. Ethan pointed lightly at the grounds outside. "Do you ever go out there?" And Adrian followed the gesture, his gaze moving across the distance before answering. "Not often," and there was something in the way he said it that felt heavier than the words themselves. Claire noticed it, not the meaning, but the weight, the kind that suggested something unspoken. Something that did not belong to the surface of this place. Silence settled again, but it did not feel empty, it felt full of things not said, and when Adrian finally turned back toward the door, his presence receding but not disappearing, Claire realized that this pattern was no longer accidental. He was returning, again and again, not for the room, not for the work, but for something within it. And as the door closed behind him, leaving the space quiet once more, she understood something that made her pause mid-motion. This was not about control anymore, and whatever it was becoming, it was moving in a direction she could not yet predict. Claire began to notice the pattern before she wanted to admit it, not in obvious ways, not in anything she could point to and explain, but in the quiet repetition of moments that did not belong to routine. Adrian returned again that afternoon, and then again the next day, never announcing himself, never staying long, just enough to observe, to stand in the same space as if testing something invisible. It was not constant, not predictable, but it was intentional, and Claire understood intention better than most. She adjusted her movements without thinking, keeping her work precise, her posture calm, her presence controlled, but awareness followed her now, not from the staff, not from the structure of the house, but from him. Ethan noticed it in his own way, not as tension, but as familiarity, the kind that children accept without questioning, and each time Adrian appeared, Ethan would glance up, not startled, not unsure, just curious, as if expecting him. That expectation unsettled Claire more than anything else. The East Wing had become their space, not claimed, not officially assigned, but allowed, and that distinction mattered more than she wanted it to. One afternoon, as sunlight stretched across the floor in long, quiet lines, Ethan sat on the rug building something from the few objects he had gathered, stacking and adjusting with focused attention, and Claire watched him between tasks, noting the way he had begun to relax here, the way his shoulders no longer held the same guarded tension they had carried for months. The door opened again without sound, and Claire did not need to look to know who it was. Adrian stepped inside, his presence as measured as always, but there was a shift now. Something less distant, not softer, just closer. He did not remain near the entrance this time. He moved further in, stopping near where Ethan sat, his gaze lowering slightly as he observed the uneven structure the boy had created. Ethan looked up, meeting his eyes without hesitation, and said, "It keeps falling," frustration threading through his voice in a way that was more honest than anything Claire had heard from him that day. Adrian crouched, not fully, not lowering himself completely, but enough to bring the space between them into focus, and for a moment, Claire forgot to breathe, because nothing about that movement fit the image she had built of him. He reached out, not touching the structure, not correcting it, just adjusting one piece slightly, aligning it in a way that made the rest steadier, and said quietly, "It needs balance." The word simple, but deliberate. Ethan watched closely, then tried again, placing the next piece with more care, and this time it held. A small smile appeared, quick but real, and he looked up again. "Like that?" And Adrian gave a single nod, minimal, but enough. Claire stood still, her hands resting on the edge of the table she had been working on, her thoughts moving faster than she could organize them, because this was not observation anymore, this was interaction, this was a line being crossed in a way that could not be undone. Adrian straightened, his attention shifting briefly toward Claire, and for a second, their eyes met again, not by accident, not forced, just aligned, and in that moment, she saw it clearly, not emotion, not vulnerability, but something close to it, something that did not belong in a place built on control. He turned to leave as he always did, without explanation, without lingering, but the room did not return to what it had been before. Ethan continued building, more focused now, more certain, and Claire remained where she was, the weight of what she had just witnessed settling slowly into something she could not ignore. This was no longer a pattern she could dismiss, no longer a series of coincidences she could explain away, and as the light shifted across the floor, marking the quiet passage of time, Claire understood something that changed the way she saw everything that had happened since the moment they arrived. Adrian Volkov was not just allowing them to stay. He was changing around them, piece by piece, in ways that even he might not fully recognize yet. Something shifted after that moment, not loudly, not in a way anyone could point to, but Claire felt it in the rhythm of the house, in the way the silence no longer pressed the same way it had before. The East Wing became more than just a quieter space, it became a place where the rules bent without breaking, where time seemed to move differently, slower, more deliberate, and Claire found herself adjusting to it in ways she did not fully realize until she caught herself exhaling more easily than she had in days. Ethan noticed it first in the simplest way. He laughed, not loudly, not disruptive, just a small, unguarded sound when one of his structures finally held without collapsing, and the sound lingered in the room like something rare, something that did not belong but was not rejected either. Claire looked at him then, really looked, and saw the difference, the way his shoulders had relaxed, the way his eyes carried curiosity instead of caution, and that alone made her chest tighten with something close to relief, even if she knew it came with a cost she did not yet understand. The door did not open this time, not immediately, and for a while, she allowed herself to believe that the pattern might pause, that the presence she had grown aware of might give them space, but awareness does not disappear once it has been recognized. It waits, it listens, and it returns. When Adrian appeared again, it was later than usual, the light outside dimming into evening, shadows stretching longer across the floor, and this time, he did not stand at a distance, he entered fully, crossing the threshold without hesitation. As if the line that had once existed no longer required acknowledgement, Claire straightened instinctively, not out of fear, but out of awareness, because every time he stepped into this space, something changed, something realigned in ways she could not control. Ethan looked up, his expression open, almost expectant now, and instead of asking a question, he simply held up what he had built, a small structure, uneven but standing, and said, "It stayed," pride threading through his voice in a way that was quiet but undeniable. Adrian paused, his gaze settling on the structure, then on the boy, and for a moment, the room held still, waiting for something that had not yet been defined. He nodded once, a small, deliberate acknowledgement, and said, "You learned," and the words, simple as they were, carried weight, not just for Ethan, but for Claire as well. She felt it in the way the air shifted, in the way the moment settled deeper than it should have, because this was no longer about observation or adjustment, this was recognition. Ethan smiled, small but certain, and returned to his place on the floor. Continuing his work with a focus that had not been there before, Claire remained still, her hands resting at her sides, her thoughts moving in quiet, careful lines, because she could see it now, not just the pattern, but the direction it was taking, and that direction did not belong to her, it belonged to him. Adrian's attention shifted then, not abruptly, but intentionally, moving from Ethan to Claire, and when their eyes met, it did not feel accidental, it felt chosen, like a moment he had decided to acknowledge rather than avoid. He studied her for a second longer than before, not searching, not questioning, just seeing, and that difference unsettled her more than anything else had. "You are not like the others," he said, his voice low, even, and Claire felt the words settle into the space between them, not as a compliment, not as a warning, but as something that carried its own meaning without explanation. She held his gaze for a fraction of a second before lowering it again, her response measured, careful. "I am here to work," because anything more would have crossed a line she was not ready to define. Something flickered in his expression then, subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, and before she could understand it, he turned away, the moment closing as quietly as it had opened. He moved toward the door, his presence receding, but the effect remained, heavier now, more defined, and as the room settled back into its quiet state, Claire realized something she could no longer ignore. This was no longer about adapting to his world, it was about how his world was beginning to adapt to them, and that kind of shift never happened without consequence. Claire tried to return to routine, but routine no longer held the same shape, not after the words he had said, not after the way his attention had lingered just long enough to change the meaning of everything that came before. The East Wing remained quiet, but now it felt watched in a different way, not by cameras or staff, but by something more intentional, more focused, and Claire found herself moving with even greater care, not out of fear, but out of awareness that every choice she made might carry weight she did not yet understand. Ethan continued building on the floor, his small world steady beneath his hands, each piece placed with more confidence than the last, and Claire noticed how he no longer hesitated before trying again, how failure no longer made him pause the way it used to, and that change alone felt significant. She finished her task slowly, her mind not entirely on the work, replaying Adrian's words, not like a memory, but like something unresolved, something still unfolding. The house carried on around them, distant footsteps, low voices behind closed doors, the controlled rhythm of a place that did not tolerate disruption, yet somehow, they had become part of a disruption that no one addressed. The door did not open for a while, and Claire let herself believe, briefly, that the pattern might break, that the attention might shift elsewhere, but belief was not something she relied on anymore. And when the subtle shift in the air returned, she recognized it instantly. Adrian did not step inside right away this time, he remained just beyond the threshold, partially obscured, as if observing without entering, and that difference mattered. It felt deliberate, like a boundary he had chosen not to cross, at least for now. Claire continued working, not acknowledging him directly, but aware of his presence in the same way one is aware of a change in temperature, gradual but undeniable. Ethan noticed too, but instead of turning, instead of asking, he kept building. Focused, as if he had accepted Adrian's presence as part of the environment rather than something separate from it. Minutes passed in that quiet balance, neither side moving to break it, until Adrian spoke, not loudly, not directed at anyone in particular, but enough to be heard. "He trusts this place," and Claire felt the weight of the observation, not as a statement about Ethan, but as something broader. Something that extended beyond the room. She paused for a fraction of a second before responding, her voice calm, controlled. Children trust what feels consistent, because that was the truth she had learned the hard way. Adrian stepped forward then, finally crossing the threshold, his gaze moving from Ethan to Claire, sharper now, more focused, as if her answer had shifted something in his understanding. Consistency is not something I offer, he said, and the words carried no apology, no regret, just fact. Claire met his gaze briefly, then lowered it again, choosing her words with care. Then he is finding it where he can, and for a moment, the silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had been said. Adrian studied her, not with the distant calculation she had seen before, but with something closer to interest, as if her perspective had introduced a variable he had not considered. Ethan placed another piece onto his structure, and it held, steady, balanced, and he smiled again. Small but certain, unaware that the simplicity of that moment had shifted something far beyond his understanding. Adrian's gaze lingered on the structure, then on the boy, and something in his posture changed, not visibly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but Claire saw it, a subtle easing, a fraction of something that did not align with control. He turned then, not abruptly, not dismissively, just finished with the moment in a way that felt intentional, and as he moved toward the door, he paused briefly, his voice quieter this time, almost to himself. It should not feel this way, and Claire did not respond, because she understood that the statement was not meant for her. It was an observation directed inward. When he left, the room did not return to what it had been, not fully, and Claire stood there for a second longer than necessary, her thoughts settling into something clearer, something she could not ignore anymore. This was no longer just a shift in his world. It was a shift in him, and whatever he was beginning to feel, it was not something he was used to, and not something he could easily control. The next morning did not feel like a new day, it felt like a continuation of something unfinished, something that had followed Claire out of the gates and settled quietly into the space between her thoughts. She moved through her routine with the same precision as always, but there was a difference now, not in what she did, but in what she expected, because for the first time since she arrived, she was not just reacting to his presence. She was anticipating it. The house greeted them with the same controlled stillness, the same measured silence, but beneath it, Claire sensed something shifting, subtle changes in the way staff moved, in the way glances lingered a fraction longer, as if the environment itself had begun to recognize a pattern that could no longer be ignored. Ethan walked beside her, calmer than he had been in weeks, his small steps steady, his attention moving freely between the details around him. And Claire noticed how easily he adjusted now, how naturally he occupied a space that had once felt foreign, and that realization carried both comfort and concern in equal measure. The East Wing welcomed them without resistance, its quiet familiarity settling around them like something almost intentional, and Claire resumed her work with careful focus, though her awareness stretched beyond the immediate, listening for the shift she had come to recognize. It came later than usual, not in the early hours, not in the quiet moments between tasks, but closer to midday, when the light was strongest and the shadows shorter, and when Adrian entered, there was no hesitation at all. He did not pause at the doorway, did not remain at a distance. He walked fully into the room with a certainty that suggested something had already been decided. Claire felt it instantly, the difference in the way he carried himself, not heavier, not lighter, just more direct, as if whatever uncertainty had existed before had begun to settle into something clearer. Ethan looked up from where he sat, his expression open, unguarded, and instead of waiting, he spoke first. "I made it taller today," his voice carrying a quiet pride that filled the space in a way nothing else did. Adrian stopped near him, his gaze lowering to the structure, studying it with the same attention he gave everything else, and after a moment, he said, "It stands because you adjusted," and the words felt different this time, not just observation, but acknowledgement of effort, of change. Claire watched the exchange carefully, noting the shift not just in Ethan, but in Adrian. The way his presence no longer disrupted the room but seemed to settle into it, becoming part of its rhythm rather than something that controlled it. She continued her work, but her focus remained divided, drawn back again and again to the subtle changes unfolding in front of her. Adrian's attention moved then, not away, but upward, scanning the room briefly before settling on Claire, and when their eyes met, it did not feel like an accident, it felt like a continuation. "You bring stability," he said, his voice low, measured. And Claire felt the weight of the statement settle deeper than she expected, because it was not directed at Ethan, it was directed at her. She held his gaze for a second longer than she had before, then responded carefully, "I bring routine," because stability was something she had learned not to promise. Adrian studied her response, his expression unchanged, but something in his eyes sharpened, as if he recognized the distinction she was making, as if he understood the difference between what she offered and what he lacked. Silence followed, not empty, but full of something neither of them chose to define, and for a moment, the distance between them felt smaller, not physically, but in a way that mattered more. Ethan placed another piece onto his structure, and it held, steady, balanced, and he smiled again, unaware that the simple act carried meaning beyond his understanding. Adrian watched it for a second, then turned slightly, his posture shifting in a way that suggested thought rather than conclusion, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost reflective. "It changes the environment," and Claire did not respond, because she knew he was not speaking about the structure, or the room, or even the child. He was speaking about something else entirely, something that had begun to take shape the moment they arrived, something that neither of them had fully chosen. And as the silence settled once more, Claire realized that whatever this was becoming, it was no longer something she could simply observe, it was something she was already part of, whether she intended to be or not. By the time the afternoon light began to soften, something unspoken had settled into the space between them, not tension, not comfort, but a quiet awareness that could no longer be ignored. Claire felt it in the way her movements had slowed, not from hesitation, but from precision, as if every action now carried a weight she had not agreed to but could not avoid. Ethan continued building, his small world steady beneath his hands, each piece placed with growing confidence, and Claire noticed how he no longer looked to her for approval every time something held, as if he had found it somewhere else, or in someone else. Adrian remained in the room longer than before, not standing still, not pacing, simply existing within the space in a way that made it feel different, less controlled, less rigid, as if the structure of the house itself had shifted to accommodate something it had not been designed for. He did not speak for a while, and neither did Claire, because silence here had become something more than absence of sound. It had become a language of its own. When he finally moved, it was not toward the door, not away from them, but further into the room, closer to the center, closer to where Ethan sat, and Claire felt that shift immediately, the way distance changed meaning when it was chosen rather than maintained. Ethan looked up again, not surprised, not uncertain, just aware, and held up another small structure. "Slightly uneven but standing, this one is stronger," he said, and there was something in his voice that felt certain, something that had not been there before. Adrian crouched slightly again, not fully lowering himself, but enough to bring the moment into focus, his gaze steady on the structure before moving to the boy. "You corrected what did not hold," he said, and Ethan nodded, as if the explanation had always been obvious. Claire watched them, her attention fixed not on the words, but on the pattern, the repetition, the way Adrian's presence had shifted from observation to involvement, and how naturally it seemed to happen, as if it had always been leading here. She realized then that this was no longer a disruption to his world. It was becoming part of it. Adrian straightened slowly, his attention shifting toward Claire, and for a moment, the room seemed to narrow again, not physically, but in a way that drew everything inward. "You anticipated the change," he said, his voice even, measured, and Claire understood immediately that he was not speaking about Ethan, he was speaking about her, about the way she had adjusted, the way she had created something stable within a place that was not designed to be. She met his gaze briefly, then answered with quiet clarity, "I prepare for what might happen," because that was the only way she had learned to survive. Something in his expression shifted then, not visibly enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for Claire to feel it, a moment of recognition that did not belong to control, did not belong to power, but to something more uncertain. Silence followed, but it was not the same silence as before. It carried something new, something that neither of them chose to define. Ethan placed another piece, and it held again, and he smiled, unaware that his small victories were shaping something much larger than he could understand. Adrian watched for a second longer, then turned slightly, his posture changing in a way that suggested thought rather than decision, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost reflective. "This is not how it is supposed to function." And Claire did not respond, because she understood that he was not speaking About the structure, or the room, or even the child, he was speaking about himself. The realization settled slowly, but once it did not fade, and Claire felt it in the way the room held its shape around them, in the way the house seemed to pause without knowing why, in the way Adrian remained there a second longer than necessary before stepping back. When he finally moved toward the door, it was not with the same certainty as before, not with the same controlled finality, and as he left, the space he created behind him did not feel empty, it felt altered. Claire stood still for a moment, her thoughts aligning into something clearer than they had been all day, something she could not ignore anymore. This was no longer about adapting to his world, and it was no longer just about him adjusting to theirs, it was about something in between, something neither of them had planned, and whatever it was beginning to matter more than either of them expected. The shift did not arrive with noise or urgency, it arrived in absence, in the subtle change of rhythm that Claire had learned to recognize before it fully formed. That afternoon, the house did not feel the same, not in the way it held silence, not in the way people moved. There was a disruption beneath the surface, controlled but present, like something had entered the system that did not belong. Claire felt it before anyone said a word. The way footsteps became more frequent in distant hallways, the way voices lowered even further when they passed, the way attention seemed to redirect outward instead of inward. Ethan noticed only that things felt different, his small movements slowing, his focus drifting as he looked toward the door more often than before, as if sensing a change he could not name. Claire continued her work, but her awareness sharpened, every instinct pulling her attention toward something beyond the room, something approaching rather than already present. When the door finally opened, it was not Adrian. A man Claire had not seen before stood at the threshold, his posture controlled but tense in a way that did not match the stillness of the house, and behind him, another figure lingered, both of them carrying an urgency that felt carefully restrained. Claire straightened immediately, her body instinctively shifting closer to Ethan, not dramatically, not enough to draw attention, but enough to place herself between him and whatever this moment might become. The man's gaze moved quickly across the room, assessing, calculating, before settling briefly on Claire and then on Ethan, and something in that glance made Claire's chest tighten, not fear exactly, but recognition that this was not part of the pattern she had grown used to. This area is restricted, he said, his voice polite but firm, and Claire felt the difference instantly. This was not a rule she had been given before, this was something new, something immediate. She nodded once, controlled. We were told to remain here, and the man's expression did not change, but something in his posture suggested hesitation, as if the instruction he carried did not fully align with what he was seeing. Before he could respond, the air shifted again, sharper this time, more defined, and Claire did not need to turn to know what had changed. Adrian stepped into the room with a presence that did not announce itself but erased everything else. The tension in the doorway shifted instantly, not disappearing, but realigning, as if the hierarchy of the space had reasserted itself without question. His gaze moved from the man to Claire to Ethan, taking in the arrangement of the moment in a single, measured glance. Explain, he said. His voice calm, controlled, but carrying a weight that did not require volume. The man at the door straightened slightly, his tone respectful, precise. There have been developments outside the main grounds, he said, choosing his words carefully. We are adjusting access points as a precaution, and Claire felt the meaning settle in, not fully clear, but enough to understand that something beyond the house had shifted, something that reached closer than before. Adrian's expression did not change, but his gaze returned briefly to Ethan, then to Claire, and in that moment, something passed between them that did not need words. Awareness, recognition, decision. They remain, Adrian said, not raising his voice, not adding explanation, just stating it as fact, and the man at the door hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding, stepping back without further argument. The room held still for a moment longer, the tension not gone, but redirected, contained within the boundaries Adrian had just reinforced. Ethan looked up, sensing the shift but not understanding it, his voice quiet. Are we staying? And Claire felt the question settle deeper than it should have, because it was no longer just about the room, or the house, it was about something larger, something moving beyond their control. Adrian answered before she could, his voice steady, certain. You are not leaving, and the words carried a meaning that extended beyond reassurance, beyond instruction, into something else entirely. Claire met his gaze for a second longer than she had before, not challenging, not questioning, just seeing, and in that moment, she understood something she could not ignore anymore. Whatever was happening beyond those walls, whatever had shifted to bring tension into a place that thrived on control, Adrian had already made a decision. And for reasons she was only beginning to understand, that decision included them. The room did not return to calm after that, not fully, because once tension enters a place built on control, it does not simply disappear, it settles, it waits, it reshapes the air in ways that cannot be ignored. Claire felt it in the stillness that followed, in the way silence no longer felt neutral, but deliberate, as if every moment now carried awareness of something beyond the walls. Ethan stayed close without being told, his small hand finding hers again, his earlier confidence softened by a question he could not fully form, and Claire held on to him just a little tighter, not out of fear, but out of understanding that something had shifted beyond what she could manage alone. Adrian remained where he was for a moment longer, his presence steady, controlled, but no longer distant, and when he looked at them now, it was not observation, it was decision. Claire saw it clearly, not in his expression, which remained unreadable, but in the way the space around him responded, the way everything seemed to align with what he had already chosen. He should not be here today, she said quietly, not challenging, not questioning, just stating the truth as she understood it, because the tension in the house was not something she could ignore, and Ethan did not belong in it. Adrian's gaze shifted to her, sharper now, more focused, and for a second, it felt like the entire room narrowed to that single point of attention. "This is the safest place," he replied, his voice even controlled, but carrying a weight that did not invite argument. Claire held his gaze for a fraction longer than she had before, not defying, not submitting, simply measuring the certainty in his words, and what she found there was not hesitation, it was conviction. Ethan looked between them, sensing the exchange without understanding it, his voice small but steady, "We are staying," and Claire felt the question settle deeper than anything else that had been said, because it was no longer about the room, or the job, or even the house. It was about something larger, something that had begun the moment they stepped through those gates. Adrian answered again, this time without pause, "You are under my protection," and the words changed everything. They were not soft, not comforting in the way reassurance usually was. They were definitive, absolute, and Claire understood immediately that this was not an offer, it was a declaration. Silence followed, but it was different now, not uncertain, not unresolved, but grounded in something that had taken shape whether she wanted it to or not. She looked at Ethan, at the way he leaned slightly into her side, trusting her to understand what he could not, and then she looked back at Adrian, seeing him not as a distant figure within a controlled world, but as the source of a decision that now included them completely. "Protection comes with conditions," she said quietly, her voice steady, because she had learned long ago that nothing offered without cost remained without it. Adrian did not look away, did not dismiss the statement, and for the first time, something in his expression shifted enough for her to see it, not control, not calculation, but recognition. "Everything does," he replied, and the honesty in it settled heavier than anything else he had said. The moment stretched, not uncomfortable, but significant, like something unseen had just been acknowledged between them. Ethan's hand tightened slightly in hers, grounding her again, reminding her what mattered most, and Claire exhaled slowly, not in surrender, not in acceptance, but in understanding. This was no longer a situation she could navigate alone, no longer something she could treat as temporary or distant. Whatever had begun here had already moved beyond that. Adrian stepped back then, not leaving entirely, but creating just enough space to signal that the moment had ended, even though its meaning had not. "Nothing will reach you here," he said, his voice quieter now, but no less certain, and as he turned to leave, the weight of that statement remained, settling into the room like something permanent. Claire stood still for a moment, her thoughts aligning into something clear and unavoidable. She had entered this place for a job, for survival, for a chance to rebuild something fragile, but what she had found instead was something far more complex, something that carried risk in ways she could not yet measure. She looked down at Ethan, at the small structure he had built still standing beside them, steady, balanced, and for the first time, she understood the truth behind it. Stability was never given, it was created, piece by piece, within whatever environment existed. And as she lifted her gaze toward the door Adrian had just walked through, one thought settled deeper than all the others. He could control the world outside those walls, he could command everything within them, but what he had just chosen, what he had just claimed, was not control, it was something else entirely, and whether he realized it or not, that choice would change everything that came next.